The cold of late spring was a stubborn guest in this corner of the Wyoming territory. It clung to the hollows and lay in dirty, shrinking patches on the north-facing slopes, a final testament to a winter that had overstayed its welcome. Thatcher Kane felt the chill not in his bones. For 40 years of this life had hardened him to it, but in his soul, it was a familiar ache, a quiet companion in the 3 years since he'd buried Margaret. The mist hanging over his 200 acres was as thin and gray as the veil that separated his world from hers. He was breathing, but he had long since stopped living. His hands, chapped and scarred, worked the wire stretcher, pulling the slack from a line of barbed steel. A length of fence near the cottonwood grove had been trampled down, likely by deer, but it was the principle of the thing. A broken fence was an invitation to trouble, and Thatcher had his fill of trouble. Scours had taken 6 of his calves last month, and the wolves, emboldened by the lean season, sang their hungry psalms from the ridges every night. The ranch was all he had left of her, of them. Its borders had to be absolute. He drove a new staple into the post with 3 clean, percussive strokes of his hammer. The sound was flat and final in the damp air. He worked with a rhythm born of endless repetition, a physical catechism that kept his mind from wandering to places it shouldn't. But the mind was a stubborn beast. He saw her ghost everywhere in the way the morning light caught the dust motes in the barn, in the empty space beside him, in their bed, in the worn spot on the porch swing where she used to sit with her mending. He was a man haunted not by a spirit, but by an absence so profound it had become a presence. A low, mournful whistle drifted up from the valley, the sound of the eastbound train pulling away from the Millwater depot. Opportunity, fate, for other people. For Thatcher, it was just a reminder of a world that continued to turn, a world he was no longer a part of. He straightened up, his back protesting, and looked toward the town, a small collection of wooden buildings barely visible through the mist. He needed supplies. He needed to see a friendly face, even if he couldn't bring himself to admit it. He needed to see Jake, hundreds of miles away. On a different train heading west, Eloise Mercer felt every jolt and sway as a small price for her freedom. The air in the passenger car was thick with the smells of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and cheap tobacco. For 2 years, she had breathed the air of Mr. Garrett's boarding house in Cincinnati, an atmosphere soured by boiled cabbage, lye soap, and the cloying scent of the landlord's pomade. This was better. This was the scent of movement, of possibility. She was a plain woman of 25, with sensible brown hair pinned in a tight bun and hands that were clean but reddened from harsh work. Her dignity was her only true possession, a shield she held tight against a world that had offered her little kindness since the fever took her parents a decade ago. In her lap, she clutched a worn valise containing 2 dresses, a Bible, and a small tin of herbs her mother had taught her to use. Tucked inside the Bible was a letter. She drew it out, careful not to tear the creased paper. The penmanship was strong, if a little clumsy. The words simple and direct. It spoke of a good piece of land, of hard work, of needing a partner to build a life with. It was signed Thatcher Kane. Eloise had read it 100 times, her fingers tracing the faint, raised watermark in the corner of the stationery, a circle with the words Millwater General Store inside. It felt like a sign, a seal of authenticity from the place that was to be her home. The letter had been her lifeline, the answer to a desperate advertisement she had placed in a gazette, her last gamble on a life that was more than mere survival. Mr. Garrett's heavy-handed pleasantries and the way his eyes would linger had become unbearable. He never crossed a line she could prove, but he had a way of making her feel like property, a constant, low-grade pressure that threatened to grind her spirit to dust. This letter was her escape. She was terrified. She feared the unknown man she was traveling to meet, feared the judgment of a town that would surely label her a mail-order bride. But her fear of the known, of returning to that life in Cincinnati, was greater. In the heart of Millwater, Jake Monroe stacked tins of peaches into a precarious pyramid. At 38, he had the easygoing manner of a man who knew everyone's business and the good sense to keep most of it to himself. His general store was the town's hub, a nexus of commerce, news, and gossip. He heard the train whistle and glanced at the clock. Right on time. A small knot of anxiety tightened in his gut. An unfamiliar sensation for the usually unflappable storekeeper. He had done a damnable, foolish, well-intentioned thing, and the consequences were now hurtling toward them on iron rails. The bell over the door jingled, and Bart Hutchkins slouched in, followed by two of his usual companions. Bart was a man whose ambitions had curdled into resentment. He'd tried ranching, tried prospecting, and failed at both. Now he mostly occupied a stool at the saloon, nursing grievances against men like Thatcher Kane, who had succeeded where he had not. "Morning, Jake," Bart said, his eyes scanning the shelves. Heard Kane lost another calf to the wolves. There was a smug satisfaction in his voice. "Tough season," Jake said, keeping his tone neutral. "What can I get for you?" "Just some tobacco, and maybe some of that paper you keep. The fancy stuff." Bart gestured toward the writing stationery behind the counter. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Running low on that?" Bart laughed. A short, ugly sound. Too busy writing love letters to keep it in stock. He winked at his friends. "Maybe I'll find myself one of them catalog women. A man gets lonely." He looked directly at Jake, a challenge in his eyes. "Some women travel a long way for a promise. Be a shame if they got here and found out the promise was empty." Jake met his gaze, his expression unreadable. A man's promises are his own business. Bart, same as his loneliness. The bell jingled again as the men left, their laughter trailing behind them. Jake exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He walked to the front window and looked out at the muddy street. He could see the road that led out of town, the one that wound its way up into the hills toward Thatcher's ranch. He had watched his oldest friend wither since Margaret's passing, had seen him retreat behind a wall of grief so thick Jake feared he'd never find his way out. So he'd taken a piece of his own store's stationery, dipped a pen in ink, and tried to throw his friend a rope. Now he could only pray the rope didn't end up being a noose. He had heard whispers, too, carried by travelers from the east. Talk of a boarding house owner in Cincinnati named Garrett, a hard man known for not letting go of what he considered his... It was a faint rumor, but it was enough to add another layer to Jake's unease. As dusk settled, Thatcher finished his chores. The work was done. The animals were fed. The fence was whole. He walked back to the small ranch house he had built with his own hands, the house he had shared with Margaret. The windows were dark. Inside, the silence was absolute. It was a cold, heavy blanket that smothered every sound, every thought. He lit a single lantern, the yellow glow pushing back the shadows but not the emptiness. On the mantelpiece sat a framed photograph, a tintype of him and Margaret on their wedding day. She was smiling, her eyes full of a light that Thatcher couldn't seem to remember how to feel. He had made a promise to her in her last days, a promise to keep living. He was failing. He was maintaining, surviving, enduring, but it wasn't the same thing. He sat down at the small kitchen table with a plate of cold beans and stale bread, the same meal he'd eaten for 3 nights running. He ate without tasting, his mind blessedly blank for a few moments. Then, from the darkness outside, a lone wolf howled, its call a long, aching cry of pure, savage hunger. Another answered from a different ridge, and then another, their voices weaving a tapestry of primal need against the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. The sound slid under the door and through the cracks in the walls, a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked just beyond the warm circle of his lantern light. Thatcher Kane listened, unmoved. He was a man surrounded by fences, yet the most formidable walls were the ones he had built around his own heart. He did not know that the train carrying the woman who held a letter with his name on it was already slowing, its brakes screeching as it prepared to stop in the valley below. He did not know that the world, which had seemed to stop for him, was about to start again with the force of a blizzard. The decision to go to the rail depot had been practical. A shipment of cottonseed cake he'd ordered was due, and with the threat of more late snow in the forecast, he wanted it in his barn, not sitting in a damp freight house. But a deeper, unacknowledged current pulled him from the silence of the ranch. The prospect of a brief, impersonal transaction, and perhaps a shared nod with a railroad man, was better than another evening spent staring at the four walls that held his wife's ghost. He saddled his steadiest gelding, Old Blue, and rode down from the high country under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. By the time he reached the valley floor, the sky had begun to weep. Not rain, but fat, wet flakes of snow that melted the moment they touched the muddy ground. An unnatural chill for late May settled in the air. He made it to the Three Pines stop, a lonely whistle stop a few miles east of Millwater proper, just as the westbound freight was shunting cars. It was a place of convenience, a siding where ranchers could load and unload without clogging up the main depot. It was also, at that moment, a place of chaotic noise and confusion. Steam hissed from the engine, mingling with the falling snow. Men shouted orders that were swallowed by the wind. Thatcher found the station master, a harried man with a clipboard, who confirmed his shipment was in the third car back, as Thatcher helped two rail hands wrestle the heavy sacks onto a waiting wagon. The storm intensified abruptly. The flakes grew smaller and harder, driven by a wind that moaned through the pines that gave the stop its name. Visibility dropped to near nothing. The passenger train, the one he'd intended to catch for the short ride back to Millwater, pulled in on the main track, its whistle a frantic shriek against the storm's fury. "She's not stopping long," the station master yelled over the din. "That snow's piling up on the pass." In the swirling white, Thatcher saw a door slide open on the train beside him, mistaking the freight train's caboose for the passenger car in the blizzard's confusion. He swung himself aboard, thinking to ride it the short distance as it reconfigured. He felt the lurch as the coupling engaged, then a second, more powerful jolt as the train began to move, but not in the direction he expected. It was pulling out, leaving the passenger train behind. He swore, turning to the door, and saw the Three Pines platform, with his horse tied to the rail, shrinking rapidly into the white oblivion. The train wasn't stopping. It was an express freight, now rerouted and bypassing Millwater entirely. 10 minutes later, with a screech of brakes, the train slowed, dropped a single car onto a siding for a later pickup, and with a great hiss of steam, began to pull away again, leaving Thatcher standing foolishly on a deserted platform miles from anywhere, in the heart of a full-blown blizzard. He was utterly alone. The wind tore at his coat, and the snow stung his face. The only structure was the small, three-sided shelter in a boarded-up freight office. Cursing his luck and his haste, he pulled his hat down low and trudged toward the meager shelter of the platform's wooden awning. And that's when he saw her. She was a specter in the storm, a woman sitting perfectly still on a hard wooden bench, a single valise resting at her feet. She was huddled in a thin wool coat, plainly inadequate for this weather, her face pale and pinched with cold. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two souls marooned by the storm. "Train's gone," Thatcher stated, the words superfluous. He stomped his boots, trying to knock the snow and the feeling back into them. "I know," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The other one, too." He grunted in assent, leaning against a support post, turning his back to the worst of the wind. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the howl of the wind and the soft hiss of snow landing on the roof. She was waiting for someone. That much was obvious. And just as obviously, they hadn't come. He felt a familiar, unwelcome pang of sympathy. It was the feeling that had gotten Margaret to talk to him at that church social all those years ago. He'd learned to smother it, Sympathy was a dangerous thing. It led to connection, and connection led to loss. "You're waiting for someone from Millwater?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She nodded, clutching her valise. "A Mr. Kane, Thatcher Kane. Do you know him?" The world seemed to tilt and then stop. The wind, the snow, the cold had all receded into a dull roar in the back of his mind. He turned slowly to face her. "I'm Thatcher Kane." Relief washed over her face. So pure and bright it was like seeing the sun break through the clouds. It was followed quickly by a flicker of confusion. "Oh, I was told you'd meet the passenger train. At the Millwater depot?" "Plans change," he said, his own confusion hardening into suspicion. "Who was this woman, and what game was this? I don't know you. Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake." The light in her eyes died. Her shoulders slumped. "A mistake? But the letter—" She fumbled with the clasp on her valise, her fingers clumsy with cold. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out to him. "It's all arranged." He took it from her, his gaze wary. He recognized the paper immediately. It was from Jake's store. His name was signed at the bottom in a bold, forward slanting hand that was a passable imitation of his own. But it wasn't his. He read the simple, heartfelt words. The talk of building a home, of needing a wife. A cold fury began to build in his chest, a rage directed at his well-meaning, meddling friend. Jake had thrown him a rope. All right, and it was tightening around his neck. "I didn't write this," he said, his voice flat and hard. He handed the letter back to her. "That's not my signature." She stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "But it has to be. It gave instructions. It led me here, to your ranch." "I don't know what to tell you, ma'am, except that I'm a widower who isn't looking for a wife. Someone has played a cruel trick on you, on both of them." Tears welled in her eyes, freezing on her lashes. She looked away from him, out into the swirling vortex of snow, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. She looked small and fragile and utterly lost. That damned flicker of sympathy returned, stronger this time. He was angry at Jake, furious even. But the woman was the victim here. The wind picked up, driving the snow in under the awning, plastering them both. The flimsy shelter was becoming useless. The single gas lamp at the end of the platform sputtered, its light a feeble, lonely beacon against the encroaching darkness. Hope, he thought, looked a lot like that lamp right now, faint and likely to be extinguished at any moment. "We can't stay here," he said, his practical nature taking over. "We'll freeze." He looked at the boarded-up freight office. "Help me with this door." He put his shoulder to the door, and with her pushing alongside him, the rotten wood gave way with a splintering crack. The air inside was stale and colder than the air outside, thick with the smell of dust and mice, but it was out of the wind. Thatcher found an old crate and, using his knife, shaved off kindling. In the corner sat a rusted potbelly stove. He managed to pry its door open and, after several attempts with his flint and steel, coaxed a tiny flame to life. They spent the next hour in near silence. He methodically broke up more crates, feeding the fire until it gave off a steady, welcome heat. She sat on an overturned barrel, as far from him as the small room would allow, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The letter, her useless ticket to a new life, crumpled in her fist. "My name is Eloise Mercer," she finally said to the fire. "Thatcher Kane," he replied, though she already knew. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He had no answer for her. He could take her to Millwater when the storm broke. But then what the town would talk. A single woman arriving for a man who claimed not to have sent for her, her reputation would be ruined before she even had one. And what about him? He could already hear Bart Hutchkins and his cronies laughing in the saloon. The storm raged all night. They huddled near the stove, the small circle of warmth their entire world. He offered her a piece of jerky from his saddlebag, which she politely refused. He saw her shiver, and without a word, he took off his heavy sheepskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. She started to protest, but he cut her off. "I'm nearer the fire." She pulled the coat around her, the scent of leather, wood smoke, and honest sweat enveloping her. It was a strangely comforting, masculine smell, so different from the oppressive pomade and boiled vegetables of her recent past. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It felt impossibly like safety. Toward dawn, the wind died down, and an eerie silence fell. Thatcher opened the door to a world transformed. A thick blanket of pristine white snow covered everything, sparkling under the first rays of a weak, watery sun. It was beautiful and treacherous. The tracks were buried. The road was gone. There would be no trains today, and no wagons. He looked at the exhausted woman asleep by the dying fire. Her face softened in slumber, the lines of worry temporarily erased. He looked out at the impassable landscape. Then he looked at Old Blue, patiently waiting, covered in a dusting of snow. There was only one way out of here. He had a choice. He could ride out alone, leave her for the railroad to deal with, and wash his hands of this whole sorry mess. Or he could accept the burden that his friend's misguided kindness had placed on his shoulders. He walked over and gently touched her arm. "Miss Mercer." Her eyes fluttered open. "The storm's passed," he said, "but the road's washed out. We've got a long ride ahead of us." The ride to the ranch was a long, cold trial. Eloise sat sideways behind Thatcher on Old Blue, her hands holding tentatively to the back of the saddle, her valise clutched in her lap. The horse plodded through the deep snow, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Thatcher said little, his body a rigid wall of muscle in front of her. He was a fortress, and she was an unwelcome refugee at its gates. Every so often, he'd point out a landmark, a stand of aspens, a ridge that looked like a sleeping giant, his voice a low rumble that was less conversation than a simple marking of territory. His territory, not hers. The house, when they finally reached it, was smaller than she'd imagined. A sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney and a wide porch. It was a lonely-looking place, tucked into the side of a hill as if for protection. A place built for two, now occupied by one. The silence inside was even more profound than the silence of the snow-covered landscape. It was a weighted, hollow silence, filled with the ghosts of conversations and laughter long since past. "You can take the spare room," he said, gesturing to a small door off the main living area. "Just for the night. When the thaw comes, I'll take you into Millwater. We'll sort this out." The words were meant to be a solution, but they sounded like a verdict. Sorting this out meant sending her away. Back to what? He didn't know or ask. She nodded, her pride a thin shield against the cold reality of her situation. She would not be a burden. She would not accept charity. The spare room was neat but unused, a fine layer of dust coating the simple wooden bed frame and washstand. It smelled of cold ashes and disuse. Through the wall, she could hear him moving about the main room, the heavy tread of his boots echoing the weight in her own heart. She set down her valise and made a decision. She could sit in this cold room and wait for her fate to be decided for her, or she could make herself useful. She walked back into the main room. He was stoking the fire in the hearth, his back to her. A photograph in a plain wooden frame sat on the mantelpiece. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile stood beside a younger, happier version of the man before her. Margaret? The house was not just his, it was theirs. "Mr. Kane," she began, her voice steady. "I have no intention of imposing, but as long as I am here, I will earn my keep." He turned, a poker in his hand, his expression unreadable. She didn't wait for his permission. She went to the kitchen area, a small alcove with a cast-iron stove and a dry sink. It was functional but neglected. Pans were haphazardly stacked. and a fine film of grease covered the stovetop. She found a bar of lye soap and a rag and set to work. She worked with a quiet, determined efficiency. The simple, physical labor a comfort. She found flour, salt, and lard in the pantry and began to make biscuits. She discovered a half-full sack of dried beans and set them to soak. Thatcher watched her for a time, his initial protest dying on his lips. He had forgotten what it was like to have another person in this house, to hear the soft sounds of domesticity. It was unsettling. It was also, to his deep and profound annoyance, a little bit comforting. He grunted, pulled on his coat, and went outside to chop wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar counterpoint to the strange new sounds within his home. What was supposed to be one night turned into 3. A warm Chinook wind swept down from the mountains, and the snow began to melt, turning the roads into impassable rivers of mud. The temporary arrangement became indefinite. An unspoken truce settled between them. He did his work, mending fences broken by the weight of the snow, checking on his herd, scattering feed for the chickens, and she did hers. She cleaned the house until it shone, cooked meals that were simple but savory, and patched a tear in his work shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She discovered he was right about the wolves. At night, their howls echoed from the surrounding hills, a chilling chorus that made the small, warm cabin feel like a tiny island in a vast, wild sea. One morning, Thatcher found tracks circling the small barn, and a new tension settled in his shoulders. The 4th morning, he came in from the barn looking grimmer than usual. "Calf's down," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee, another one. "The scours." "Is there nothing to be done?" Eloise asked. He shook his head, staring into his cup. "It's the 3rd one. Better to end it quick than let it suffer and infect the others." His voice was flat, resigned. Eloise thought of the small tin in her valise. "My mother, she knew herbs, for fevers and fluxes. She taught me some things." He gave her a skeptical look. "A city girl talking about country remedies. This is cattle sickness, Miss Mercer, not a child's cough." "It cannot hurt to try," she insisted, her chin set with a stubbornness that surprised him. He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Do what you will." She followed him to the barn. The calf was a pitiful sight, lying listless in the straw, its mother lowing anxiously nearby. Eloise knelt, her skirt sinking into the muck, and gently examined the small creature. She spoke to it in a low, soothing voice as she felt its feverish skin. She returned to the house and came back with a poultice made of ground willow bark and other herbs, mixed with warm water. She carefully opened the calf's mouth and administered a small amount, then brewed a stronger tea from yarrow and chamomile leaves, which she patiently coaxed the calf to drink from a bottle. For 2 days, she tended to the calf. Thatcher watched her from a distance, saying nothing, his skepticism warring with a reluctant admiration. He saw the gentle way she handled the animal, the tireless patience in her actions. He saw a strength in her that her delicate frame belied. On the 3rd morning, the calf stood on wobbly legs and took a few hesitant steps toward its mother. That evening, as they sat by the fire, a new, more comfortable silence settled between them. The howling of the wolves outside seemed less threatening. "You saved him," Thatcher said, breaking the quiet. "I'd have put him down." "He just needed a chance," she replied softly. He looked at the picture on the mantel. "Margaret was like that," he said, his voice thick with memory. "She could find the life in anything. She planted a garden up here on this rock, and damn if she didn't make roses grow." It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name with anything other than grim finality. He told Eloise about building the cabin, about the day Margaret had insisted they adopt a half-wild stray dog, about her laughter, which he said sounded like water running over stones. He spoke of the pain of her loss, a raw, honest wound he had never shown to anyone. Eloise listened, her heart aching for him, for the woman with the kind eyes, and for the life they had lost. A few days later, Thatcher saw a rider on the ridge overlooking his property. It was Bart Hutchkins. He wasn't on the road. He was on Thatcher's land, just sitting on his horse, watching the cabin. He saw the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. He might have even seen Eloise as she stepped outside to throw scraps to the chickens. Bart stayed for a few minutes, then turned his horse and rode back toward town. Thatcher's jaw tightened. The rumors would be starting now. He was a widower living with a strange woman in a town like Millwater. That was a fire that needed only a single spark of gossip to rage out of control. That night, alone in her room, Eloise took out the letter again. She read the words, so full of hope and promise. The man who had taken her in was kind, in his own gruff way. He was honorable and hard-working. But he was not the man who wrote this letter. The man who wrote this was looking for a future. Thatcher Kane was shackled to his past. Her fingers traced the paper, feeling its texture, and stopped on the faint, raised circle in the corner. She held it up to the lamplight. Millwater General Store. The paper, the promise. It hadn't come from a distant stranger. It had come from right here. The trick that had been played on her was not a faceless one. It had a name and a place. It came from the very heart of the town she had hoped to call home. The sky, which had been clear for days, began to cloud over that evening. A storm was rolling in, different from the snowstorm, this one full of thunder and lightning. As darkness fell, the first drops of rain began to patter against the roof, quickly turning into a downpour. The wind rose, rattling the window panes. A tremendous clap of thunder shook the house, and a flash of lightning illuminated the room in a stark, blue-white glare. Eloise flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. Thatcher looked over at her from his chair by the fire. She was trying to hide it, but he could see the tremor in her hands. Another crash, closer this time, made her jump. "Storms bother you?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, embarrassed. "Since I was a child." He stood up and walked over to the hook by the door, taking down his heavy sheepskin coat, the one he had given her at the train depot. He walked back and draped it over her shoulders. "It helps," he said simply. The warmth and weight of it were instantly calming. As she pulled it closer, her hand brushed against his. A current, as real and as sudden as the lightning outside, passed between them. He didn't pull away. Instead, his calloused fingers closed gently around hers. He looked at her, his eyes dark and full of 100 unspoken emotions, grief, loneliness, and something new, something tentative and fragile. He lifted her hand, his gaze never leaving hers, and pressed a soft, brief kiss to the back of it. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, a silent apology, a question, and an acknowledgement all in one. It was more intimate than any passionate embrace. It was the sound of a lock, rusted shut for 3 long years, beginning to turn. He released her hand slowly and went back to his chair. His face turned toward the fire, leaving the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin long after the thunder had faded into a distant rumble. The kiss, as brief as it was, had changed the air in the cabin. The walls that had separated them, built of grief and suspicion, had not vanished, but a door had been opened between them. The following days were filled with a careful, watchful tenderness. He found himself looking for her as he worked, and she found herself listening for the sound of his horse's hooves in the evening. The silence in the house was no longer hollow. It was a comfortable quiet, filled with the small sounds of 2 people sharing a space. But the letter lay between them, an unspoken truth, a debt that had to be settled. The mud on the valley road finally dried enough for a wagon to pass. Thatcher announced it at breakfast, his voice carefully neutral. "The road is clear. I'll take you to Millwater." Eloise met his gaze across the small table. Her hands were folded around a warm cup of coffee. "Before we go," she said, her voice soft but firm, "there is something you must see." She retrieved the letter from her room and laid it on the table, pointing to the faint watermark in the corner. This paper came from the Millwater General Store. Thatcher stared at it. Of course. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The casual questions Jake had asked weeks ago about his finances, about his loneliness, the way his friend had looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration. It could only be one person. A cold, quiet anger began to smolder in his gut, replacing the tentative warmth that had begun to grow there. It was a more familiar feeling, and in a way, easier to bear. "Get your things," he said, his voice clipped. "We're going to see Jake." The ride into town was tense. Thatcher drove the buckboard with a grim set to his jaw, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Eloise sat beside him. The silence a stark contrast to the easy quiet they had shared just the day before. Millwater came into view, a cluster of unpainted buildings huddled along a muddy main street. It looked raw and temporary, a town clinging precariously to the edge of the wilderness. Men stopped what they were doing to watch them pass, their gazes lingering on Eloise. She felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her back straight, her eyes forward. She had faced down Mr. Garrett's insinuations for 2 years. She would not be cowed by the stares of strangers. Jake was behind the counter when they entered the store, a cheerful smile on his face that vanished the moment he saw Thatcher's expression. He looked from Thatcher's thunderous face to Eloise's composed one, and the color drained from his own. He knew. "Jake," Thatcher said, his voice dangerously low. He placed the letter on the counter between them. "You want to tell me what this is?" Jake looked at the letter, then at his friend. He didn't try to deny it. He let out a long, slow breath and leaned on the counter, his shoulders slumping. "I was throwing a lifeline to a drowning man. Thatch, that's all it was. A drowning man." Thatcher's voice rose. A whip crack in the quiet store. "You call this a lifeline? You lied to me. You lied to this woman. You brought her halfway across the country on a fool's errand and dropped her in my lap without a word. I watched you die, day by day, for 3 years." Jake shot back, his own voice rising with passion. "I watched you seal yourself up in that cabin with Margaret's memory until there was nothing left of the man I grew up with. I tried talking to you. I tried everything. This was a desperate move. Maybe it was wrong, but my reasons were right." Eloise stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Thatcher's arm. The muscles there were tense as coiled steel. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice cutting through their anger. "I believe you had good intentions, but you have placed me in an impossible position. My reputation, my future. You gambled with them to save your friend." Jake had the grace to look ashamed. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not an object in his plan, but a woman of quiet strength and dignity. "You're right, ma'am. I didn't fully consider. I was just so focused on him. I am truly sorry for the distress I've caused you." Thatcher shook his head, the anger still churning. "Sorry doesn't fix it. Jake." Before the argument could continue, the bell over the door jingled. Bart Hutchkins and 2 of his companions swaggered in, their eyes immediately locking onto the trio at the counter. A slow, malicious grin spread across Bart's face. He had seen them ride in. He had been waiting. "Well, well," Bart said, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Look what the storm washed in. Kane's mail-order bride. Heard you took the scenic route to the ranch. Ma'am, skipping the wedding vows and getting right to the housekeeping. Are we?" Thatcher turned slowly. Every ounce of his anger at Jake now found a new, sharper focus. "That's enough. Bart," he said, his voice flat and cold. Bart laughed. "Just making an observation. A man takes a woman into his home, a woman of uncertain background. Folks are bound to talk. It ain't respectable." "You don't know the first thing about respect," Thatcher said, taking a step away from the counter. his body positioning itself between Bart and Eloise. "And you will not speak to this lady that way again." Lady Bart sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. It landed with a wet smack. That's not what I hear they call them in the city. That was it. Thatcher didn't shout. He didn't move fast, but his right hand dropped, hovering just inches above the worn leather grip of the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. The store went utterly silent. The air crackled. Eloise's heart hammered against her ribs. This was not the frontier of books and stories. It was a cold, hard reality where a man's life could be forfeit over a misplaced word. "You're going to apologize to Miss Mercer," Thatcher said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. Bart's bravado faltered. He looked at Thatcher's eyes and saw no bluff, only a cold, hard promise. He glanced at his friends, but they offered no support, their faces pale. They were drunkards and bullies, not gunmen. I didn't mean no harm," Bart stammered. "The apology," Thatcher repeated, his hand unmoving. Bart swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at Eloise, his eyes full of resentment, but he mumbled, "Sorry, ma'am." "Louder," Thatcher commanded. "I'm sorry," Bart said, the words clear this time. He couldn't meet her eyes. Without another word, he and his friends turned and practically fled from the store. Thatcher's hand moved away from his gun. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Eloise, his eyes searching her face for fear. He saw it, but he also saw something else, a deep, unwavering resolve. Jake, who had been frozen behind the counter, finally moved. "Thatch, We'll talk later," Thatcher said, his voice weary. He turned to Eloise. "We should get the supplies we need and go." As they gathered flour, coffee, and salt, Eloise stopped by a bolt of cheerful yellow calico fabric printed with small blue flowers. "The curtains in the cabin are threadbare," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. They let in the drafts. It was a simple, domestic statement, a quiet claim on the future, a signal that she was thinking of turning his house into a home. Thatcher looked at the fabric, then at her. He thought of the drab, gray curtains Margaret had sewn, now faded and worn. He thought of the relentless gloom they seemed to hold. "Jake," he called out, his voice still rough but the worst of the anger gone. "Measure out enough for 2 windows." The ride back to the ranch was as quiet as the ride in, but the quality of the silence had changed again. It was no longer angry or awkward. It was thoughtful, heavy with the weight of all that had happened. The public defense, the forced apology, the purchase of the curtain fabric, they were actions, not words, and they spoke volumes. As the ranch came into view, nestled in its protective hollow, Eloise finally spoke. "We cannot go on like this," she said, her gaze fixed on the house ahead. "Living in this uncertainty. It's not fair to either of us, and it's not right." Thatcher pulled the wagon to a halt. He turned on the seat to face her. "What are you proposing?" "I am proposing a fresh start," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The letter was a lie. Our meeting was an accident. Everything that has happened since has been born of necessity. I want something born of choice." She took a breath, her courage solidifying. "I propose 1 month. Mr. Kane, for 1 month, you will court me properly. We will talk. We will eat meals together. We will get to know one another not as a rancher and a refugee, but as a man and a woman. We will be honest about your past and about mine. And at the end of that month, we will make a decision. A real one. If you decide you still want a life of solitude, I will leave. I will find work in Millwater or move on. No hard feelings. And if I decide that I cannot make a life here, I will do the same." He stared at her, stunned by her audacity, her practicality, her sheer, unshakable dignity. She was not asking for a promise. She was asking for a chance, a fair one. She was offering him a way out of the limbo they were in, and a way back into the world of the living. if he was brave enough to take it. "You would stay?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "After all this, after what happened in town?" "What happened in town showed me what kind of man you are," she said simply. "Now, I'd like the chance to know the man himself. 1 month, Thatcher. That is my offer." He looked at her, at the strength in her clear eyes, at the determined set of her jaw. He thought of the long, empty evenings, of the crushing silence, of the gray, threadbare curtains, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt a flicker not of sympathy, but of hope. "All right, Eloise," he said, testing her name on his tongue. It felt right. 1 month. The agreement of 1 month began not with courtship, but with the quiet rhythm of shared labor. The days settled into a pattern. He would rise before dawn, and she would already have the coffee brewing, its rich aroma a welcome greeting in the cold morning air. They worked in their separate spheres, he in the fields and with the cattle, she in the house and the garden, but their paths would cross throughout the day. A shared drink of water from the well, a brief discussion about a coming storm, a look that lingered a moment longer than necessary. The house began to change. The scent of baking bread replaced the stale smell of disuse. The new yellow curtains, sewn with Eloise's tiny, perfect stitches, captured the morning sun and filled the cabin with a cheerful, golden light. But the raw, damp chill of the late spring storm had settled deeper than the mud on the roads. It had found a home in Thatcher's lungs. It started with a cough, a deep, rattling sound he tried to suppress. Then came the fever. He fought it for 2 days, his stubborn pride refusing to admit weakness. He continued his work, his movements growing slower, his face pale and beaded with sweat. On the 3rd morning, Eloise found him in the barn, slumped against a hay bale, shivering uncontrollably despite the warmth of the day. "You're sick," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "It's nothing," he rasped, trying to stand and swaying on his feet. She put a firm hand on his arm. "It is not nothing. You are coming inside, now." For the first time since she had arrived, he didn't resist. He leaned on her, his formidable strength gone, and let her guide him back to the house and into his bed, the bed he had shared with Margaret. The fever took hold completely then, plunging him into a world of disjointed memories and shivering cold. For 3 days and nights, Eloise was a constant, steady presence at his side. She brewed willow bark tea to fight the fever and concocted a pungent broth of onions and garlic to clear his chest. She bathed his face with cool water, changed the sweat-soaked linens, and sat in a chair by his bed, watching him breathe in the dim lantern light. In his delirium, he spoke. He called out for Margaret, his voice full of a raw, desperate yearning that made Eloise's heart ache. He gave orders to men long gone, reliving a cattle drive from a decade past. But through the fever fog, he also became aware of her. He would open his eyes and see her silhouette against the window, her face etched with concern. He felt the cool, gentle touch of her hand on his forehead. He heard her soft voice, urging him to drink, assuring him he was not alone. She was not the ghost of his past. She was the solid, unwavering reality of his present. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He woke to the smell of clean sheets and fresh air. Eloise was sitting in the chair, asleep, her head resting on her arms. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He felt weak, washed out, but his mind was clear for the first time in days. He looked at the sleeping woman who had nursed him, a stranger who had faced down his grief, his anger, and his illness with a quiet, unshakable grace. He had been so determined to keep the world out, and yet the world had walked right in and saved his life. His recovery was slow, but hers was fast in decline. The sleepless nights and constant worry had taken their toll. The day he was finally strong enough to sit by the fire, she collapsed while washing the dishes. A sudden, frightening faint. He caught her before she hit the floor, her body alarmingly light in his arms. Her skin was burning with fever. The sickness had passed from him, to her. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over him. He carried her to the spare room and laid her on the bed. He was a man who knew how to set a broken bone on a calf, how to stitch a wound on a horse. He knew nothing of caring for a person. Margaret had always been the caregiver, the one with the gentle hands and the soothing voice. He felt a surge of his old helplessness, the familiar despair that had been his companion for 3 years. But then he looked at Eloise, her breathing shallow, her face flushed with fever, and a new feeling pushed the panic aside, a fierce, primal protectiveness. She had fought for him. Now he would fight for her. He became the nurse. His initial movements were clumsy, his large, calloused hands awkward as he tried to bathe her face. He burned the first batch of broth and nearly dropped the second. But he remembered the things she had done for him. He kept a constant supply of cool water by her bed. He sat with her through the long nights, listening to the sound of her breathing, a fragile rhythm in the vast silence. He talked to her, telling her stories of the ranch, of his boyhood. His voice a low, steady rumble meant to tether her to the world. As her fever began to subside, she grew restless, murmuring in a troubled sleep. She spoke a name, Garrett, her voice laced with a fear that made Thatcher's blood run cold. She tossed and turned, crying out, "Leave me be, I have done nothing wrong." He sat on the edge of her bed and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You're safe, Eloise," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm here. You're safe." When she was finally lucid, weak but clear-eyed, he brought her a cup of weak tea. They sat in silence for a while, the afternoon sun warming the small room. "You talked in your sleep," he said quietly. "You spoke of a man named Garrett." She looked away, her gaze distant. "He was my landlord in Cincinnati, the owner of the boarding house where I worked." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He was a man who enjoyed his power. He never crossed a line, not a line the law would recognize. But there are other lines. He had a way of looking at you, of standing too close. He made you feel as though you were a piece of his property, and he was just waiting for the right moment to claim you. It was a quiet kind of tyranny. It's why I answered the advertisement. I had to get away." Thatcher listened, his hands clenching into fists. He thought of Bart Hutchkins and his sneering words in the store. He thought of the stares from the townspeople. It was the same poison, just a different bottle. He reached out, his fingers covering hers where they rested on the quilt. "No one will ever make you feel that way again," he said, his voice low and intense. "Not any man, not this town." He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the open doorway, through which the main room and the mantelpiece were visible. Not even a memory. It was a vow, a promise to protect her not just from the world, but from the ghost that lived in his house, the ghost that had occupied his heart. Later that week, when she was strong enough to move back into the main room, a comfortable domesticity returned, but it was deeper now, forged in the crucible of sickness and shared vulnerability. They sat by the fire that evening, the new yellow curtains drawn against the night. The tintype of him and Margaret rested in its usual place on the mantel, her kind, smiling eyes seeming to watch over them. Thatcher stood up and walked to the fireplace. He picked up the photograph, his thumb gently brushing away a speck of dust from the glass. He looked at his wife's face, a face he knew better than his own. And then he turned and looked at Eloise. She was watching him, her heart in her eyes. He didn't put the photograph down. He held it in one hand as he walked back to her. He knelt before her chair, so his eyes were level with hers. "Margaret was my life," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Losing her, it was like the sun went out. For 3 years, I've been living in the dark. I thought that was the only way to honor her, to keep her memory alive." He looked from the photograph to Eloise's face. "But you didn't bring a candle. Eloise, you threw open the shutters and let the sun in. It's not the same sun. It's new. It doesn't replace the old one. But it's warm. And it's real." He set the photograph carefully on the small table beside her chair. He placed it with reverence, a part of their story now, not a barrier to it. Then he framed her face with his hands, his touch gentle but sure. He leaned in and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste kiss on her hand. This was a kiss of profound, heartfelt truth. It was a kiss of gratitude, of acceptance, of a future chosen, not stumbled into. It was the kiss of a man coming back to life. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. The house was quiet. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for the first time, it did not feel like a place of ghosts and memories. It felt like home. The kiss had been a turning point, a quiet declaration that shifted the foundation of their arrangement from a temporary truce to a shared future. The following Sunday, Thatcher hitched the buckboard. It was a clear, bright morning, the air washed clean by the recent storms. "We're going to church," he announced, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Eloise looked at him, her hands smoothing the front of her best dress, a simple gray cotton she had mended and pressed with care. "Are you sure?" she asked. "People will talk." "Let them talk," he said, his jaw set. "We have nothing to be ashamed of. I will not have you hiding in my house like a secret." It was his way of saying he was proud to be seen with her, a public claiming. The church in Millwater was a simple, unpainted building with a small steeple and a clear-paned window that looked out onto the mountains. As they walked up the steps, a hush fell over the small groups of people gathered outside. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Eyes followed them. Thatcher felt Eloise's hand tremble slightly on his arm, and he covered it with his own. A warm, reassuring pressure. He nodded a curt greeting to a few men he knew, his gaze unwavering, daring anyone to make a comment. No one did. They sat in a pew near the back. The sermon, delivered by a young, earnest Reverend Daniels, was on the parable of the lost sheep, on the importance of redemption and the celebration of a second chance. Eloise listened intently, the words resonating with a deep, personal significance. She felt Thatcher's presence beside her, solid and comforting, a bulwark against the curious and judgmental stares she could feel on her back. After the service, as they were leaving, they found their path blocked by a small contingent of the town's most devout women, led by a stern-faced woman named Martha Gable, the blacksmith's wife. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice dripping with false piety, her eyes pointedly ignoring Eloise. "It is a surprise to see you among us. We had all thought you were occupied with your mourning." "Mourning has its season, Mrs. Gable," Thatcher replied, his tone polite but cold as ice, "and so does living." Martha's gaze finally shifted to Eloise, looking her up and down as if she were a piece of livestock of questionable breeding. Indeed, the Reverend's sermon was most timely. Though some sheep stray so far, one wonders if they can ever truly be returned to the flock. Before Thatcher could unleash the sharp retort building in his chest, Eloise spoke, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. "I found the Reverend's words very hopeful. Mrs. Gable. He reminded us that the shepherd leaves the 99 to search for the one. He doesn't ask the sheep where it has been, or judge the mud on its fleece. He simply rejoices that it is found." She met the woman's hard gaze without flinching. "I believe that's a lesson for all of us. After all, the church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints." A stunned silence fell over the group. Mrs. Gable's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She had been countered not with anger, but with her own scripture, and she had no defense. Eloise gave a small, polite nod, and Thatcher, a flicker of immense pride in his eyes, gently guided her past the speechless women and toward the wagon. They had faced the town, and they had not broken. The following week, the weather turned hot and sultry. The sun beat down, melting the last of the high country snow, and the creeks and rivers swelled with the runoff. One afternoon, The sky turned a bruised, greenish black, and the air grew heavy and still. Thatcher, mending a harness on the porch, looked up at the clouds gathering over the peaks. "Flash flood," he said, his voice grim. "Get the chickens in the high coop. I'll check the lower pasture." The rain came suddenly, a torrential downpour that turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud in minutes. Thunder cannonaded through the valley. Thatcher rode out toward the gully at the edge of his property, a deep ravine that was usually little more than a dry, rocky ditch. He knew the new calves, born just a few weeks prior, often sheltered under the cottonwoods on the far side. By the time he reached it, the gully was a raging brown torrent, thick with debris. On the far side, huddled together on a rapidly shrinking island of high ground, were 3 terrified calves, their mothers bellowing in distress from the near bank. The water was rising fast. In another 10 minutes, they would be swept away. Eloise appeared at his side, a heavy coil of rope slung over her shoulder, her hair plastered to her face. "I thought you might need this," she shouted over the roar of the water. There was no time for a plan. He took the rope, tied one end securely around the thick trunk of a pine tree, and handed the other end to her. "Don't let go, no matter what," he commanded. He tied the free end around his own waist, took a deep breath, and waded into the churning water. The current was immensely powerful, tugging at his legs, trying to pull him under. The water was frigid, and the rocky bottom was slick and treacherous. He fought his way across, the rope his only lifeline, held firm in Eloise's hands. He could feel the tension on it, the small, steady adjustments she made as he moved. She was his anchor. He reached the other side, gasping for air, and untied the rope from his waist, securing it to another tree. Creating a taut line across the torrent, he managed to get a lasso around the first calf and, half pulling, half guiding, began to work it back across, using the main rope as a handhold. The small animal fought him, its eyes wild with terror. As he reached the middle of the gully, a large log, torn from upstream, came barreling down the current. Thatcher saw it at the last second and shoved the calf forward. Taking the full, glancing impact on his side, he lost his footing. The current grabbed him, pulling him under, his grip on the rope torn away. Thatcher Eloise screamed, her voice a raw cry of terror. For a heart-stopping moment, he was gone. Then his head broke the surface. Yards downstream, he was being swept away. Eloise didn't hesitate, still holding her end of the main rope. She scrambled along the muddy bank, keeping pace with him. She saw a smaller rope, the lasso he had used, still tied to the calf that had made it to safety. With frantic strength, she untied it, quickly fashioned a loop, and hurled it with all her might. It fell short. He was being pulled faster now. She tried again, paying out more line, aiming ahead of him. The loop landed in the water just in front of him. With the last of his strength, he lunged, his fingers closing around the slick, wet hemp. She dug her heels into the mud, wrapping the rope around her body, and held on. The force of the current pulling against his dead weight was staggering. The rope cut into her hands, but she did not let go. She held the line, the slender thread connecting him to life, connecting their lives to each other. Slowly, painstakingly, he was able to pull himself toward the bank, where he collapsed, coughing and exhausted, in the shallows. The other 2 calves were lost, but he was alive. They had saved what mattered most. That night, after they had recovered, a new, unspoken enemy came. They were woken from a deep sleep not by a sound, but by a strange, flickering orange light dancing on the walls of the cabin. Thatcher was out of bed in an instant. He looked out the window and his blood ran cold. A line of fire was creeping across the lower pasture, moving steadily toward the hay barn. The wind, which had died down after the storm, was picking up again, fanning the flames. "Bart!" he snarled. It was not a question. This was the coward's answer to the public humiliation in the general store. Eloise was already dressing. "What do we do?" "You get a bucket and soak the wall of the house nearest the fire," he commanded, pulling on his boots. "I'll try to head it off at the barn." He fired 3 shots into the air, the universal signal for help in the high country, then grabbed a shovel and a wet burlap sack and ran toward the flames. The heat was intense, the air thick with acrid smoke that burned his lungs. He beat at the edges of the fire, trying to smother the hungry flames, but for every section he put out, the wind would whip another to life. It was a losing battle. The fire was moving too fast. The barn, full of dry hay, would go up like a torch, and the house would be next. Just as despair began to set in, he heard the thunder of hoofbeats. A wagon careened down the road. Jake Monroe at the reins, his face grim in the firelight. Behind him were 2 other ranchers, neighbors from the next valley over, men of few words but solid character. "Saw the light from my place?" Jake yelled, leaping from the wagon with more wet sacks. Figured it was Hutchkins's brand of trouble. The 4 of them fought the fire with a grim, desperate fury. They dug a fire break, a wide trench of bare earth, their shovels striking sparks against the rocks. They beat at the flames with the heavy, wet sacks, grunting with the effort, their faces black with soot. Eloise, her face smudged and her dress soaked, ran back and forth from the well, bringing them buckets of water, her presence a silent, steady source of strength. For over an hour, the battle raged, a small, human struggle against a primal force. Finally, their firebreak held. The flames, starved of fuel, licked at the bare earth and slowly began to die down. The barn was safe. The house was safe. They stood in the smoldering, blackened field, leaning on their shovels, chests heaving, a small band of allies silhouetted against the dying glow. As the adrenaline faded, Thatcher scanned the ridge behind the pasture. For just a moment, he saw them 2 figures on horseback, watching the scene from a safe distance. One was almost certainly Bart. They saw the fire was beaten, and without a backward glance, they melted back into the darkness. The threat was gone, for now. But Thatcher knew it wasn't over. Bart Hutchkins had tried to burn him out, to destroy everything he had. He had failed this time, but he was a man fueled by resentment and humiliation. He would be back, and the next time, he would likely not be satisfied with just setting a fire. A tense peace settled over the ranch in the week following the fire. The blackened scar on the pasture was a daily reminder of the violence that lurked just beyond their fences. The month of their agreement was nearing its end, but the timeline had been rendered meaningless by the trials of flood and fire. They were no longer a man and a woman conducting a cautious experiment. They were partners, forged into an alliance by shared danger and mutual care. But the threat of Bart Hutchkins lingered in the air, a promise of unfinished business. The real trouble, when it came, did not ride in with a torch in the dead of night. It arrived on the noon stagecoach, a man in a dark wool suit and a bowler hat, carrying a polished leather satchel. He looked out of place in the dusty, raucous environment of Millwater, his face pale and his hands soft. He took a room at the boarding house and made his way to the saloon, the natural clearinghouse for information in any frontier town. He bought a bottle of whiskey and asked questions. He was looking for a young woman, an employee of his from back east, who had, he claimed, absconded from her duties. Her name was Eloise Mercer. It didn't take long for him to find a willing ear. Bart Hutchkins, nursing a cheap beer and a festering grudge, saw the stranger as a gift from a vengeful god, for the price of a few drinks. Bart told him everything about the mail-order bride who wasn't, about the woman living unchaperoned at the widower Kane's ranch. He painted a picture of scandal and impropriety, a story the stranger was all too eager to believe. The next afternoon, 2 riders approached the Kane ranch. One was Bart Hutchkins, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. The other was the stranger from the city. Thatcher saw them coming from a long way off. He met them on the porch, his stance relaxed, but his hand never far from his side. Eloise came to the doorway behind him, her face paling as she recognized the man in the bowler hat. It was Mr. Garrett. "Miss Mercer," Garrett said, his voice smooth and oily, as if it had been bottled in his Cincinnati office. He dismounted, leaving Bart on his horse. "I have come a very long way to find you. I must say, I am disappointed to find you in such rustic circumstances. I am no longer in your employ, Mr. Garrett," Eloise said, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "I owe you nothing." "That is where you are mistaken," Garrett replied, pulling a sheaf of papers from his satchel. "You signed a 2-year contract. You left before your term was fulfilled. Furthermore, you left with an outstanding debt for room and board, a debt I was generous enough to extend to you." He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "The law is quite clear on these matters. You are, for all intents and purposes, my property until this debt is settled. I have come to collect what is mine." Thatcher stepped forward, his body shielding Eloise from the man's poisonous gaze. "This woman is under my protection," he said, his voice a low growl. "She has no debt here, and she is nobody's property. You'd do well to get back on your horse and ride out." Garrett's smile widened. "Ah, the noble protector. Tell me, Mr. Kane, does the town know the full nature of your protection, a man of your standing, a widower, taking in a woman of her station, a woman who ran away from a respectable establishment? It would be a terrible shame if your reputation were to be tarnished by her scandal." He was not making a threat of violence, but of something far more insidious, the threat of social ruin. "This is not the place for this," Thatcher said, his mind racing. He could not win this fight here, alone. This was a battle that needed witnesses. "We will settle this in town, in front of everyone, tomorrow at noon." Garrett looked surprised, then pleased. A public stage was exactly what he wanted. "Excellent," he said. "I have every confidence that the good people of Millwater will see the righteousness of my claim." The next day, the town square in front of Jake's General Store became an impromptu courtroom. It seemed the entire population of Millwater had turned out. Garrett stood on the porch of the store, looking confident and officious. Bart Hutchkins stood near him, a belligerent scowl on his face. Thatcher and Eloise stood on the ground below, facing him. Thatcher's face was a granite mask, while Eloise held herself with a quiet dignity that was its own form of defiance. Garrett began, laying out his case in a calm, reasonable tone. He spoke of contracts, of debts, of his duty as a Christian man to look after the welfare of a wayward young woman who had fallen under his care. He painted Eloise as a flighty, ungrateful girl who had abused his kindness. When he had finished, Thatcher spoke. "There is no contract," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "There is no debt. There is only a woman who sought a new life, and a man who sought to control her." "And what proof do you have of that?" Garrett countered smoothly. "All I see is a woman who answered an advertisement for a wife, and a man who now conveniently claims he never sent it." "That's because he didn't," a new voice said. Jake Monroe stepped out of his store, holding the infamous letter in his hand. He walked to the center of the crowd. "I wrote it," he announced, his voice clear and steady. He explained everything, his fear for his friend, his misguided attempt to help, his use of the store's stationery. He took the blame, fully and publicly. "The only sin here," he concluded, looking directly at Garrett, "is a friend's foolishness. Eloise Mercer came here on a false promise, one that I made, not Thatcher." Garrett's composure wavered for the first time. His case was built on the idea that Eloise had willingly entered an arrangement she had then broken. Jake's confession had just blown a hole in that foundation. As if on cue, a wagon train that had been camped west of town began to roll through the main street. A young woman, walking alongside one of the wagons, stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the man on the porch. Garrett saw her and his face hardened. "Marianne," Eloise whispered. recognizing the girl who had worked as a scullery maid at the boarding house. The girl, Mary Ann, looked like she was about to run, but she saw Eloise, and she saw the crowd, and a flicker of courage ignited in her eyes. She stepped forward, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "That man," she said, her voice barely audible at first, but gaining strength. "Mr. Garrett. He does this. He keeps a book of debts, for food, for a broken dish, for being sick. No one can ever pay it off. You work, and you only fall deeper in. He tells you can't leave until it's paid, but it's never paid." She looked at Eloise, tears welling in her eyes. "She's telling the truth. I ran away, too." The crowd began to murmur. The story from one woman could be dismissed as a lie, but from two, Garrett's credibility was dissolving in the midday sun. His face flushed with anger, his mask of civility finally cracking. His legal threats had failed. All he had left was venom. "You will listen to the word of this trash," he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at Eloise. "A common runaway with no family and no morals. She comes here and bewitches a grieving man, moves into his home, into his bed." Thatcher moved. He didn't run. He walked up the steps of the porch with a slow, deliberate purpose that was more terrifying than any charge. He stopped directly in front of Garrett. "You have slandered this woman's name for the last time," Thatcher said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "You have questioned her honor. Now, you will answer for it, not with papers and lies, with your hands." He began to unbuckle his gun belt, letting it fall to the wooden planks with a heavy thud. "No guns, no knives, just you and me. A fair fight." Garrett stared at him, his eyes wide with panic. He was a man of threats and intimidation, not of physical violence. He looked to Bart for help, but Bart took a half-step back, unwilling to involve himself in this. The men of the town formed a circle. This was a justice they understood. It was clean, simple, and final. Garrett, seeing no escape, balled his soft hands into clumsy fists. He threw a wild punch, which Thatcher easily sidestepped. Thatcher's response was not wild. It was methodical. A hard, driving blow to the gut that knocked the wind out of Garrett. A second, clean shot to the jaw that sent the city man sprawling in the dust. It was over quickly. Thatcher stood over him, not with rage, but with a cold, righteous fury. "It's done," he said. He looked to the crowd. "Reverend, some paper and a pen, if you would." Reverend Daniels produced a piece of paper. Thatcher hauled Garrett to his feet and, with Jake Monroe and two other ranchers as witnesses, dictated a short, simple statement. In it, Garrett renounced all claims, financial or otherwise, against Eloise Mercer and Mary Ann, and swore never to bother either of them again. Humiliated, his face already bruising, Garrett signed it. As Garrett was slinking away to lick his wounds, Jake Monroe turned to Bart Hutchkins. "You brought him here. Bart, you fed him the lies he wanted to hear. You traded this town's peace for a bottle of cheap whiskey." Every eye in the crowd turned to Bart. He was surrounded by the cold, contemptuous silence of his neighbors. There was no place for him here anymore. He was an outcast. Without a word, he pushed through the crowd and stalked toward the saloon, a man already on his way out of town. That evening, a gentle rain began to fall, washing the dust from the air. A soft, clean sound on the roof of the cabin. The storm had finally passed, in every sense of the word. Thatcher and Eloise stood on the back porch, watching the last of the light fade behind the mountains. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Thatcher turned to her, his face serious in the twilight. He took her hands in his. They were strong, capable hands, hands that had nursed him, saved him, and held his own. "Eloise," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "our month is over, and everything that has happened has been a test of fire and water. The man who wrote that letter, He was a fiction, a ghost conjured up by a well-meaning friend. I am not that man. I am a widower, set in my ways, with a memory I will always cherish. He paused, his thumbs stroking the backs of her hands. But I want to be the man who builds the life that letter promised. A real life, one of hard work and honesty and love. I want to build it with you. He looked into her eyes, his heart open and vulnerable for the first time in years. Eloise Mercer, will you marry me? Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of joy, washing away the last of the fear and uncertainty. Yes, she whispered. Oh, yes, Thatcher. Yes. He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, her body molding against his. The last of the tension, the last of the walls between them, crumbled into dust. He kissed her then, a deep, searching kiss filled with the promises of a shared future. Inside the cabin, the lamp she had lit cast a warm, golden glow, and in that circle of light, he held her, his head resting against hers, her hands entwined in his. A quiet, unshakable promise in the peaceful aftermath of the storm. Their wedding was not a grand affair. It took place on a Wednesday, a working day, in the same simple church where they had first faced the town's judgment. The pews were not full, but the people who came were the ones who mattered. Jake Monroe stood beside Thatcher, his face beaming with a relief and joy that was so profound it was almost painful to witness. His wife, Sarah, sat in the front row, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked that morning for Eloise. The ranchers who had helped fight the fire were there, their face scrubbed clean, their hats held respectfully in their hands. Even Martha Gable attended, sitting near the back, and as Eloise walked past, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was not friendship, but it was respect, earned not by words but by the quiet evidence of character. Reverend Daniels kept the service short and heartfelt. He spoke of new beginnings, of finding strength in partnership, and of the grace that can be found in the wake of hardship. When Thatcher slid the simple gold band onto Eloise's finger, his hands, usually so steady with rope and iron, trembled slightly. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not the haunted widower she had met in a snowstorm, but a man whose heart had found its way back into the light. The town did not instantly embrace them with open arms, but a gradual thaw began. Like the slow melting of a late spring snow, respect, in a place like Millwater, was a currency earned through sweat and integrity, and the Canes paid their dues daily. People saw the way Thatcher's ranch began to thrive, the fences stronger, the herd healthier. They saw Eloise in the garden she cultivated behind the house, a small patch of earth that soon overflowed with not just vegetables, but with rows of medicinal herbs. She had a knowledge passed down from her mother, an understanding of the healing properties of yarrow and comfrey, of chamomile and mint. When the blacksmith's son came down with a croupy cough that winter, it was a syrup of her making that finally gave him a peaceful night's sleep. When a ranch hand's horse threw him and left him with a deep, angry gash, it was her poultice of plantain leaves that drew out the inflammation and left a clean, thin scar. She never asked for payment, but a sack of flour would appear on their porch, or a fresh churned wheel of cheese, or a finely tanned deer hide. Slowly, quietly, she was becoming not just Thatcher's wife, but a vital part of the community's fabric, a healer in her own right. Thatcher, for his part, began to look beyond his own property lines. He saw the children of the outlying ranches, who received no formal schooling, and an idea took root. With Jake's help, he organized a work party to repair the old, abandoned one-room schoolhouse that sat on a patch of common land. He was not a learned man, but he was practical. He could fix the roof, glaze the windows, and build sturdy desks. They hired a young woman whose own family had been passing through on their way to Oregon, a woman with a year of teaching college behind her, and paid her a small salary collected from the handful of families who now had a place to send their children. Thatcher found a new purpose in the sound of children reciting their letters. In the sight of them gathered around a pot-belly stove he had installed himself. He was no longer just maintaining a legacy, he was building one. They did not forget the past. The photograph of Margaret still sat on the mantelpiece, but it was no longer a shrine to what was lost. It was a testament to a love that had shaped the good man Thatcher was, a part of the foundation upon which their new life was built. Eloise would sometimes find him looking at it, his expression not of sorrow, but of a quiet, peaceful remembrance. He had learned that a new love did not betray an old one. It honored it by proving the heart could live and grow again. As the first anniversary of the day they met in the storm approached, Eloise began to move with a new, gentle slowness. A quiet joy radiated from her, a secret she and Thatcher shared with the silent mountains and the wide-open sky. She was with child. The knowledge settled into the small cabin, filling every corner, a promise of a future they had scarcely dared to dream of. Thatcher began to spend his evenings on the porch, not staring into the darkness, but working. He had found a beautiful piece of pine, straight-grained and free of knots, and from it he began to carve a cradle. His hands, so accustomed to the rough work of the ranch, moved with a surprising delicacy. He smoothed every edge, sanded every surface until it was as soft as worn leather. He carved the headboard with the shape of 2 intertwined roses, a quiet tribute to the flowers Margaret had made grow, and to the new life Eloise was nurturing. It was an act of love, a physical manifestation of all the words his quiet nature could not always express. He was not just building a bed for his child, he was crafting a vessel for all his hopes. The baby, a son, was born in the early autumn. As the aspen leaves on the high slopes were turning a brilliant gold, he had Thatcher's dark hair and Eloise's calm, steady eyes. They named him Samuel. The spare room, which had once been a dusty, forgotten space, was now filled with light and life. The pine cradle Thatcher had built stood by the window, a perfect, handmade testament to their journey. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, Eloise stood on the porch, rocking the cradle with her foot. The air was cool and crisp. From inside, she could hear Thatcher's low voice as he read aloud from a book. It was a peaceful, domestic sound, a sound she had once believed was beyond her reach. From the valley below, a lone rider was making his way home, the faint, rhythmic sound of his horse's hooves a steady beat in the twilight, and from the cradle at her feet came the small, hiccuping cry of a newborn, a sound not of distress, but of a new and hungry life asserting its presence in the world. The old tragedies, the lonely grief, the desperate fears, they were not gone, but they had been absorbed, their sharp edges softened and woven into the rich, complex, and beautiful tapestry of a life being lived, a love chosen, and a future just beginning. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We'd love for you to comment with where you're listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.